We'll talk about some concepts of inverse condemnation, but we'll also draw on some cases that I've had with inverse condemnation that have concluded, and also about one or two inverse condemnation cases that I have currently going on. So the learning objectives, what we want to achieve today is talk about the common basis for action. If you're faced with some facts that may give rise to inverse condemnation, we'll talk about the effective strategies for successfully litigating these cases. And we'll talk about the latest developments and trends. Now, there was a case that came out, I think 2 or 3 years ago, City of Orville, which if any of y'all have practiced in this area, I'm sure you've heard of it. We'll talk about that near the end, but that, I think my recollection is correct, was the first time the California Supreme Court has weighed in on inverse condemnation, I think in the last 20 years. So it's a very, very significant case. Some people think it changes the lay of the land. I tend to disagree, but we'll talk about that near the end. In summary, we are exploring the practice of inverse condemnation. And so this course, from CEB's perspective, is designed for experienced real property attorneys. So by way of introduction, and nice shot of here at Southern California, let's start by talking about what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about eminent domain. So there's no discussion about that. That's where the government comes in and they condemn personal property. And then they pay the owner of the property fair market value. There is some overlay with eminent domain and inverse condemnation, especially in regard to valuation. So there'll be some commonality between the two, but we're not talking about eminent domain. We will also not be talking about regulatory takings. So when you start to look at inverse condemnation, you can kind of put it in two different baskets. You have in regard to what's called taking. One basket is going to be regulatory takings. Leave that aside. We're not talking about that. The other basket is going to be actual damage to property. That's what we're talking about, which goes back to what I said in the beginning. A good bit of my practice is to property damage, which sometimes involves inverse condemnation. We are also not talking about federal law. We're going to stick with state law. Federal law, this comes up, of course, with the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.